Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the Middle East Conference. This is the second day. We're really excited to have you here. We have a group of great speakers for you today. We had a really good day one, and we're really excited to kick off day two. If we can put up the agenda for day two, we'll start off with some fireside chat sessions. We have the great Tarek Sultan from Agility. Then we'll go to some of the unicorns, I guess, Noon, and then we have Talabat. And then we're going to have a small break. After the small break, we're going to have two panels and one more fireside chat session. The two panels will be e-commerce and fintech. We're really excited to have everybody here, and we look forward to some really, really great conversations. And not to mention, we have some unbelievable moderators for these sessions. So to kick things off, we'll start off with the agility session with CEO Tarek Sultan, and moderating this session will be Hisham Al-Bahar, Managing Director at Green Dome Investments. He has 17 years of logistics experience. He was also previously CEO of Posta Plus. And I will hand over to Hisham now to get the session started. Hisham, you're on.
Thank you, Yazid, and welcome everyone. First, let me just quickly introduce Tarek. Tarek started with Agility in 1997 as a CEO, and he managed to take the company to become one of the largest companies in the world, with $5.2 billion in revenue and 100 countries being served and 26,000 employees. It's great to have you here, Tarek. Tarek, you're on mute if you don't mind.
Thank you.
Oh, fantastic. So Tarek, you know, I'm personally inspired by Agility. I'm born and brought up in Kuwait, and so firsthand how Agility grew and the growth trajectories of over these years. You know, you've demonstrated a unique strategy, growing the company through acquisitions. I think 40 acquisitions over the past many years. So please, can you tell us more about that journey and the challenges you went through?
Sure. I mean, first of all, thank you for having me. I think this is a great opportunity. As you mentioned, Agility actually started in 1978 as a state-owned company. The founder of the company at the time made the wise decision of not investing any capital in the financial markets. So this is something that I think is very appropriate and very relevant to all of your stakeholders. And basically, in so doing, invested in warehousing and sort of real estate acquisition, and avoided the Manach stock market bubble in the early 80s. So it's one of the few companies that came through that crisis unscathed. And I think it also has a message, you know, for everybody that could be useful depending on what your circumstances are. The company was privatized in 1997, you know, just a little bit before that, before I got involved in that privatization, we founded a small advisory firm that would help the government, or basically was targeted to engaging in government kind of privatizations. We did a number of privatizations early on. I actually borrowed the capital for that company from my wife. So remember that, everybody. You know, I think that's a interesting little caveat there. We were involved in a number of privatizations early on. Burgan Bank, National Real Estate Company, a few others, Agility, and then finally Zain came and the government stopped the privatization program. So I think that should tell everybody a little bit about how comfortable governments are about privatization programs, especially in the Middle East. I think it's something we'll talk about later on. You know, it's not always such a friendly relationship between the private sector and the public sector. Something they should maybe teach a little bit more about in business school. I think after the Agility acquisition, it was very clear that the company was focused exclusively in Kuwait, and we felt that was that was a little bit of an issue going forward, especially because, and doing any business in the emerging markets, you're quickly sort of confronted with how pervasive the public sector is. And one of the fortunate things that I was actually able to witness firsthand was how extensive government regulation can be. In fact, in business school, I never knew what a lot of these government agencies actually did. I'm sure a lot of the same applies to a lot of the people that are in your programs. School is like, they should teach us more about what government does, and we got to experience that firsthand. So that was helpful for us, because we were able to kind of see all those stakeholders and how they operated in a microcosm. That would actually really help us down the road, to be honest. The other, I think, issue is that we also recognized very early on that the relationship between the government and the public sector was an ambivalent one, especially in the Middle East. And we felt that would be something that we'd have to get used to if we wanted to grow in the emerging markets, to be honest. So those kind of two kind of general introductions really, I think, helped us start thinking about how we wanted to grow the business. So we started off by acquiring a business in Dubai. It was a third-party logistics service provider. Their warehouse was full of liquid refreshments, maybe there's a message to us. Maybe we should have pivoted our business right then and there, but we didn't. But it actually, we kind of kicked off our process of going global. Our first acquisition was in Dubai, and I think the idea that that's also gives you an idea of what a great job Dubai has done in actually putting the Middle East on the map in terms of global business. So in fact, that was our starting point for our own kind of growth. But then we also did something not unusual, but we invested in a state-of-the-art facility, and we invested a lot of money in technology. And we developed a concept where a third-party logistics provider could basically extend their business model to their stakeholders through the web with a payment gateway. In fact, we were planning on having 300 or 400 customers operating out of the same facility using a common fulfillment platform. It's a great idea, right? Fantastic idea, but it flopped. The reason it flopped is a little bit too early. I think it's like a little bit like a mini Amazon on steroids. It really didn't pick up commercially, but out of that flop, it's interesting how sometimes things flop and then they actually end up panning off down the road. Along comes September 11th, 2001, if my memory is correct. The U.S. government decided that they needed some logistics partners in the region. And when they came and they plugged in their systems to the digital systems that we put in place in the late 90s, early 2000s, their systems were actually enabled in a way that even they hadn't imagined. So, for example, the U.S. military, they used to use an RFID technology. The problem is that technology had only 50 character sets. So you can imagine if you have a manifest of 1,000 items, you lose all the ability to actually have all the kind of the interesting data that you want at your fingertips in kind of a battlefield environment. We actually enabled all of that with our real-time supply chain, with our satellite systems. So, the military plugged in to what we were doing, and, we became a fairly short period of time. We grew our business to about $10 billion in U.S. government contracting. We're the second largest contractor to the Defense Logistics Agency after BP, which is kind of an interesting one. During the process, we also grew through acquisition. We used the opportunity and the cash flow that we had to basically acquire 40 companies. and kind of amalgamate them under this. I mean, at the beginning, they all had their own brands. And, so you could imagine what a nightmare that might have been. You're buying 40 different companies with different entrepreneurs, all with their different ideas of how to run a business. I mean, we can talk all day about the horror stories there, but that, I think that really, really helped us, gave us the opportunity to actually rebrand as Agility, which was, necessary to actually bring these acquisitions on board. One of the issues that we had when we were looking at rebranding, it's like, how do you rebrand? And this is also, I think, a really interesting idea. We looked at our competitors, and all of our competitors were large global companies. So being global wasn't necessarily a differentiator. So, but we were fortunate; they all had robotic-sounding names: TNT, DHL, UPS. While those companies were all global, they were very difficult for them to interact on a one-to-one basis with entrepreneurs and stakeholders, and that was our company's strength. So we rebranded around that capability, and I think that's something that resonated with our entrepreneurs and allowed us to sort of put something together that was pretty interesting. So, other than our supply chain business, which is present in 100 countries, we're also a large provider of industrial real estate services. So we're funding warehousing and e-commerce infrastructure all over the world, primarily in the emerging markets. We're investing in a number of sort of like other infrastructure businesses around fuel logistics, airport, fuel logistics. And even sort of recently, we invested in a kind of a new age shopping mall that we're going to be developing in Abu Dhabi. And finally, this area of technology, where we're really doing a lot of interesting things. I think we'll touch on a little bit later. But just in summary, how do we think we're a little bit different? A, we're open to opportunity. B, we're an emerging markets company. We were the only one of the global top 10 companies in the supply chain space that actually started in the emerging markets. So that gave us an advantage. Obviously, we think in terms of a mindset, being able to deal with some of the complexities of doing business in the emerging markets. We've invested heavily in digital leadership, which we might talk about. And then in this area of sustainability, which has recently gone crazy. So that hopefully that wasn't too long. I tried to give you the story in a nutshell, but that's basically it.
Yeah, thank you. The word agility just resides with me, how powerful it became over the past couple of years. Looking backwards, when you guys came up with this name, it didn't really make sense to a lot of people. I think it wasn't as popular as it is today. So well done at choosing that name. But you said like you've had like a 40 acquisition. I believe by now you guys have a playbook of how to make an acquisition successful. But we know M&A always caveat that not all the companies that you acquire tend to be successful, and you kind of touched very briefly on it. But can you tell us about the challenges that you guys went through when you're acquiring those businesses? What are the key learnings that you came across from them?
So there are too many learnings there to really summarize in a quick discussion. But I'll give you some. Sorry. No, I think you. How about now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that.
No.
So I think there are a lot of lessons. First, I think in a traditional context, the probability of success if you stay close to your core business is always greater, right? That's what they teach you in business school, right? For sure. There's a you're less likely to screw up if you do that. You're going to be more on top of the stakeholders and the risks in the business. So there's a key, message there that's really important. Also, the idea that businesses with networks have unusual layers of synergies. sometimes you can add 1 + 1 together and get 15 if you have a network business. And that is why it's so important to build a network in the first place, because it actually creates basically, it magnifies your ability to assimilate acquisitions profitably, because you can buy something basically, you can buy at a market price, but the value you get out of that acquisition is really tenfold of what you've paid, because of the way those synergies work. And you have to look at the synergies around the stakeholders, around the way you buy, in our instance, where you buy freight. Sometimes you basically have a complete sort of industrial synergy where the management teams that you acquire, sometimes they're no longer needed in a network business. I mean, if you have two CEOs in China, you're not going to need, you're not going to need two, you only need one, and you're going to pick the better one. So that's part of the beauty of having a networked business. I think one other lesson is that systems are important going early in. And we had some systems that were really advanced, but others were really old. So the freight forwarding systems that we had were green screen technology, and they were done on COBOL, and they're impossible to change. When I say impossible, I mean, it's impossible. You can put as many transformation guides as you want into that environment, and you're not going to change. It's almost that. They're designed to be bulletproof systems. They are literally bulletproof. It helps if you have the technology up front that will allow you to simulate acquisitions. You don't always have that luxury. In our case, we didn't. I wish we would have had better technology up front. In our business, we grew both organically and inorganically until we reached a stage where we covered 95% of the global GDP. And what that meant to us was, okay, well, if we really want to grow in a country, we have the platform to do it, and we can probably go after it organically. And that's kind of been our mindset for the last few years. Having said that, there's a limit to that. I think, and when you look now at the kind of the framework of the industry, it's very clear that we either have to acquire another large company so we can basically capture those synergies, or somebody has to acquire our business. I mean, it's that simple, because the amount of industrial, I would say, synergy that's kind of available in that sort of a transaction is if you had the best 20 CEOs in logistics, you would never get the same amount of value created as you would by doing one of those kind of transactions. So that kind of gives you a little bit of like how we are looking at acquisitions and how we've looked in the past and the future. But then there's also the non-traditional perspective. Non-traditional perspective is that as a global business, we can benefit entrepreneurs by plugging them into our stakeholder base. So we have examples of entrepreneurs that were running companies in Dubai. I'm not going to name it, but one was a $500,000 EBITDA company with about $5 million in revenue. We plugged it into our global network. Today, it's over $100 million in EBITDA, and with the same entrepreneur that was running the business at the time. In fact, he wanted to sell out his share of the business. We actually forced him to keep. He wanted to keep only 10%. We made him keep another. We actually had the ability to take him out, and we didn't. We kept him, and he thought we were nuts. But in the end, it really worked out to our benefit. We basically plugged him into a global network, introduced him to our customer set, and it's kind of the same sort of strategy or playbook that we're using with our tech ventures. And then again, so even with our startups, tech startups, we're using that same kind of concept. We're basically introducing them to stakeholders that would take them years to actually kind of approach, and we're doing it on a global basis. So there's a lot of value there for companies that we're acquiring, potentially part or in whole, in the tech space.
you've touched on the point of acquiring businesses with entrepreneurs, and I think I've seen that firsthand. Usually, entrepreneurs to have a bit of a resistance to be acquired by conglomerates like your company, and simply because they want to preserve their culture of innovation and remain agile. And they fear that if they were part of this big company, they will jump into that the whole bureaucracy and the whole red taping culture that could, restrict them from being innovative as they were. So how does companies like Agility today kind of like mitigate this, kind of create an incubant for those startups?
Well, the first part of that answer is you have to recognize the parts of your business and your culture that are potentially hostile to entrepreneurs. And not every part of your business can be entrepreneur friendly. And if you take freight forwarding, for example, these guys are fighting for nickels and dimes, tooth and nail, around the world. In many cases, they're actually fighting their own kind of network. So, like if Brazil is doing a deal with China, they're trying to get a few extra dollars on a container at the expense of their colleagues in China, right? So you can imagine in that sort of environment, any sort of tech initiative would basically be shut down very quickly because it's not generating cash flow. It's basically losing money. They would cut that out in a day, let alone in a week or 2 weeks. So you need to recognize that. I think second, and if you have that sort of business, you should really completely separate the innovation process from that business, both in terms of management structure and the way you kind of deal with it. That's, I think, a common way that you might want to handle. But in our case, we had a complete ecosystem for innovation. So we have an in-house kind of team that's actually incubating a number of supply chain concepts that are kind of related to our core business. They compete with our business. There is some synergy, but they also compete. And it's called the Shipper brand of companies. They're all digital freight kind of, and we're working there with entrepreneurs. We're working there with different tech teams than we have in our core business. But we're trying to leverage some of the synergies that might come from having a large freight network. So some of the buying power, some of the access to customers, and some of the global footprint that we use for actually providing services. But then, we realized there's a whole set of other kind of interesting concepts that we felt that we wanted to kind of look at. And we have a partnership with a company called Kali Capital. Kali is like a chess move. I'm not a chess expert. It's an early stage venture firm that we've partnered with, and where we're actively investing as a startup with startups at an early stage. The advantage of doing that is that it gives us, people are investing alongside of us that are in many cases much smarter than we are, better connected. So they actually give us some validation as, around some of the concepts that we're looking at. But more importantly, we interact with the management teams over 3 or 4 or 5 year period. So we get to see firsthand which ones of those management teams are going to be winners. And you can kind of double down and reinvest in those businesses. And then the more recent type of innovation we've been doing is around this area of SPACs. There's one called Queen's Gambit. It's the same principles that we backed out of Kali Capital. They are providing basically capital for IPO-ready companies through these SPACs. And that's, when we look at it, we have all the way from the startup to kind of like in the middle, all the way to like now an IPO strategy for some of those companies. And I'll give you like a couple examples of what these companies are, because I think they're super interesting. One is Helion. Helion's a company that uses renewable natural gas to make an electric truck. The difference between it and a normal electric truck is that it has 3 times the range. It costs 30% 40% less than diesel, way less than electric truck. So you're talking about a technology that we could take potentially to our main customers who are all environmentally, focused these days. And you can say, listen, we can save you 30% savings on your trucking cost, and you're going to have net negative carbon emissions. So imagine how powerful of an image of a kind of a concept that is. In the past, we used to have to fight with the core business to actually look at sustainability. For now, we've had a paradigm shift where the technology is actually less expensive than than what they're actually disrupting. So it makes our life easy. Company called BitPesa using they're using cryptocurrencies to actually do money transfers around the world. Fantastic. They've been using Bitcoin for 3 years now. Bread, a company that's doing like fintech in terms of like loan origination. This company was already sold. CargoX, a Uber-type trucking company in Brazil. Market Muse is a company that uses AI to help us write better content for digital companies. She's like, okay, so you have all these digital ideas. How are you going to write content that gives you kind of SEO capability and SEO type, I would say, awareness on the web? We're using AI to do that, and this company is actually, making us look great. We're using them to write better content with fewer writers. So, and we have to pay less for advertising. So I think that's a way we're using technology to help us not only in our core business, but to invest in that technology. Company called Radar. Radar is doing wireless checkout for retail. So Amazon has a kind of similar concept, but it requires hardware. With this technology, you will have fewer staff in the store. You'll have real-time inventory. You'll have real-time checkout without cashiers. You can imagine the cost savings and the impact that will have to the retail industry. These are some of the technologies we're bringing to Abu Dhabi, but these will be global technologies shortly. Immaculite. Immaculite is a company that came out of the COVID world. They're using lighting systems to actually disinfect your work environments. So special type of light that uses two types of UV lights, easy to retrofit, and basically it's purifying the air that we breathe and killing the pathogens that are basically leading to causing COVID to sort of basically proliferate, but other diseases as well. You go on and on. A company called TVP Solar, they just launched a large field with Aramco. It's a solar thermal panel that they're using to replace gas at Aramco. That's gas and diesel that's consumed in their industrial processes. So think about that. It's cheaper for Aramco to use these panels to boil water, to heat other processes than it is to use gas or diesel. That sort of stuff is exciting because it tells you how big potentially these market opportunities are. Anyway, it goes on and on, but that gives you a little bit of a hint into the little bit of ecosystem that we have that we think is unique.
And kind of you answered my question around, what type of technologies you guys are looking at closely. Do you think that's there's a lot of hype around also supply chain as a service, and I mean, did you guys have a chance to look at that as well, or because we know AI has been disrupting the whole industry, and we know that a lot of companies right now is moving into much more the technology around IPA, like intelligent process automation and front automation, because our business is really much driven by people. And on that layer, there's companies right now are trying to develop some sort of capabilities around forecasting and managing demand. Would you think this some sort of a an interesting space in that direction, or? Sorry, you're on mute again. Sorry.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the number of technologies that are proliferating, with digital, in digital and with the use of the data, it's really an RPA. It's so extensive. I mean, we have we're trying to get a handle on some. RPA is actually a really big one for us because, as I mentioned, some of our core freight systems are still in the age of COBOL. So, I mean, that's where you can actually put, this RPA technology to work and really get some interesting efficiencies that, a lot of you might assume that would be kind of come off the shelf with a normal kind of a normal tech stack. Well, we don't have that luxury. But the flip side of that is that if you try to introduce some of these modern systems into a global network, sometimes the bandwidth issues and the infrastructure requirements for that new technology is really a much bigger impediment than you might imagine. So having access to RPA, IoT as well, is really transforming our business.
I'm kind of conscious of the time. I wish I've got like at least a lot of questions for you, but I'd like to close with this one last question. I think it's about what you started with. And you've been some sort of a forceful advocate of economic diversification, GCC, and the growing share of private sector in the region, the regional economy, in particular SMEs and startups. How do you see today the ecosystem for the startups and SMEs in our region? And kind of comes with that, what are the barriers and what are the keys to unlock them?
This last year has been brutal for SMEs. And it's not just in the Middle East, but if you can imagine, so first you had 80% of the cargo capacity in airplanes basically going offline. That's because most cargo is being transported in the belly of passenger aircraft. That went offline. Okay, so they somehow compensated by bringing new kind of freighters online, but still overall kind of volumes are down maybe 30%, 40% from what they were in the past. Same time, shipping industry has gone through a similar crisis where they took a lot of capacity offline because the crews couldn't travel between countries. China was basically exporting it. So basically, we had a situation where freight costs went up 6 and 7 times. Now, in that environment, what happens? SMEs are getting deprioritized. So, for example, I mean, it happens even in our company. If you have a global customer, like a Nestle, for example, that company is going to get prioritized over SMEs when it comes to global freight, especially when in that sort of environment. So let's just say this last year was a terrible year for SMEs, both on the supply chain front, but also in the if you had to look in the kind of the Middle East, the problem with I would say I'm going to generalize here and talk more about the GCC countries. We have fairly high government involvement in the economy, and in many instances, we were lagged. All of the GCC countries lagged their Western counterparts in actually stimulus, and you're like, so why? And you're like, why? Why is that? Because the attitude inside the government officials is that, well, guys, 90%, 80% of employees are basically on the government payroll. So what kind of stimulus are you talking about? Why should we give a stimulus to SMEs? So a lot of SMEs, thousands, went out of business in this last year. There's some that benefited from obviously the pivot to more digital constructs. But I think overall, the SME sector was decimated. I'm looking forward to seeing some statistics as to what actually happened. But my gut feeling is that there was a tremendous loss of SME businesses in the last year.
I agree with you, Tarek. Unfortunately, we came to the end of our session. I wish we could have extended a little bit more, but I want to run over the next session. So thank you so much, Tarek, for your time. We appreciate your input, and I'll pass it now back to Yazid. Thank you.
Tarek, Hisham, thank you so much. Honestly, this has been an exciting session personally for me, since I'm also in the logistics business. So it's been really wonderful to hear from a legend like Mr. Tarek and Hisham as well. Thank you so much for your time. First of all, my colleagues were telling me I never introduced myself. My name is